Anyway, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It really is a pleasure. I'm just going to assume that everybody's heard of Quorn. Yes, great. Well, actually, a few years ago, maybe 10 yeers ago, that would be a bit of a no, not quite sure what it is. So, and that reflects, I think, some amazing things that we've seen, and particularly in the last 4 years, this transition. So, but I'm going to use Quorn as a case study, a story, but really to illustrate the title of my talk, although it says Route to Health and Wellbeing, I think it's more about why we need healthy new proteins with a low environmental impact, why we believe that they're very important. Now, some of the things I say, I don't expect you to necessarily agree with me. I hope you do, but you possibly won't. But they're the points of view, but all designed to illustrate that point. But the first question I thought you might have is, who is Tim Finnegan? So that's me. So I'm married, a couple of kids, now both grown up, great. Although, as I said to a colleague earlier who's just announced they're having their first child, the first 20 years are the worst, and then it gets expensive. Anyway, if you didn't believe me, there's Mrs. Finnegan. We don't talk about the other guy, it's complicated. I'm only kidding. There's the kids, yeah, there you go. So anyway, you didn't come here to see my holiday snaps or the family, but so I've spent a lifetime in looking at sort of vegetable proteins, so one or two excursions into other businesses, but going sort of right back to what feels like the late 1800s now, when I did my PhD in extracting rapeseed protein, or canola as our American colleagues and Canadian colleagues like to know it. So, and as I said earlier, it's been a lot of my time has been spent with Quorn, with a variety of owners. But the great thing is, I think in the last 4 years, particularly probably since Horsegate, that we've just seen a sea change in consumer attitude, and certainly, in terms of sales, both UK and internationally, for Quorn products. And you might have seen that Quorn was recently acquired by an Asian business for the princely sum of 550 million. So, when I think back to when we started, or when I started, when we were looking at this stuff, going, what are we going to do with that then? To sort of where it is now, it's quite a journey for a great British success story, I think. However, I am here in part to tell the Quorn story, but not totally. As I say, this is an illustration, I think, of a successful commercialisation of a new protein, but more importantly, why we need healthy new proteins with low environmental impacts. And the good news being, of course, that it can be done. So, because Quorn has done it. So we will spend a lot of time talking about very important new innovations, and it does seem that the media in particular like to focus on we're all going to be eating lab meat and insects in the future, and kind of ignoring that here's a very good example of the very successful international commercialisation of a new protein. So it can be done, but it takes time. It's taken us 50 years to get here. So to understand where Quorn has come from and the context, I think, for new proteins, you have to look right back to the 60s. Now, 60s was, of course, a time of great achievements. I can remember this, England winning the World Cup, never to be seen again, no doubt. Although it'd be more painful to be Scottish this week, wouldn't it, really? But separate sport. And I can also remember first man on the moon. Anyway, a time of great achievement in the 60s, but also a time of growing concern. So this was the time when the world genuinely thought it was going to run out of protein in many countries. Some great books around at the time, piece of historical narrative now more than anything, but this book is very good. This is the prediction of 1975 that we were going to run out of protein. And this was driving an awful lot of activity and innovation. And of course, it didn't turn out in the way that people thought it was going to turn out, largely because of the Green Revolution, which you've probably come across, and the work of the American agronomists and scientists who transformed agriculture at the time. But at that time, this is our founder. So this is Lord Rank from Rank Hovey McDougall. You might remember them. They were acquired by Premier Foods some while ago. Premier Foods then also actually acquired Quorn, so slightly ironic the way it all works together. But Rank did this amazing thing, I think, in 1964. And that's quite important because although I think for a lot of people, Quorn in particular is quite a sort of new innovation that they've just come across. It's surprising for a lot of people to know that actually the idea goes right back to the 1960s. So it is a 50-year overnight success for a lot of folks. Now, Rank did this, I think, incredible thing that having looked at what people thought was going to be the impending protein crisis, he decided that something needed to be done. So he set his scientists out on a journey to go and discover what they talked about at the time as the world's first new food since the potato. And what they were looking for was a microorganism, one that had the capability of transforming the then plentiful starch into the less plentiful protein. And of course, being a baking and a flour milling company, they had plenty of starch that they were wasting at the time. I think it was spraying it onto fields. So eventually they found what they were looking for in about 1967. And it was quite a brave thing to do, because although mankind has eaten microorganisms for thousands of years, it's usually because they do something to something. So I don't know, like yeast in the manufacture of bread or in alcohol. But rather than eating the whole of the biomass itself. So that was the idea. And eventually, as I say, they found what they were looking for. It was a tiny member of the fungi family, after a few false starts, that was found in Andy Smallwood's compost heap in Marlow in Buckinghamshire. So there you go. I don't know if that's true, but that's what I'm told. So it's something that grows quite naturally, but what the guys at RHM found is that this little member of the fungi family had amazing nutrition, could be scaled up. That was really important. So, having discovered it growing wherever it was in the compost heap, it actually had the capability of being able to be grown at scale. And also, at some point, somebody discovered that you could create amazing textures from this that actually emulated meat. So you had the sort of perfect coming together of a new protein source that was highly nutritious, that actually could be put together in a way, in a format that people enjoyed and textures that people enjoyed. But really, I think an amazing visionary rank, and absolutely no idea that this was going to have any sort of technical or commercial gain. This was, and it's something that I guess he died in 1972, so he never actually really saw the fruits of his vision. But I think people talk about he was coming to the end of his career and he was thinking about legacy, and this sort of resonates with what's happening today, where there's the similar problems as we'll talk about in a minute, but just a lot bigger. But you've got to hope there's this idea growing of intergenerational equity, where business leaders, people like Gates, for example, are thinking about legacy and are investing in trying to solve these problems in a way that perhaps governments are not addressing adequately. Anyway, so that was Rank, 1964, 50-year overnight success, and the idea for Quorn was born. And many hundreds of millions, literally, pounds later of speculative investment by a whole variety of companies, from RHM through, I think DuPont got involved at one point, Gisbricard, and of course ICI in the 80s, then Zeneca, and then Premier Foods. It's a whole host of people very interested in this area. We are where we are today with new ownership and a business value of, a business sale of 550 million or 800 million euros. It sounds better like that, doesn't it? Anyway, so not a bad little journey from Andy Smallwood's compost heap to a 550 million pound sales price. So 1964. Oh God, I forgot to put this one in. So there you go. That's me in 1964, and that's me in 1985. So there's a hell of a. In all that time, that's how long it took for the idea to actually result in the first product on the shelf. So that's the amount of investment and research that was going on. And of course, as Alan will talk about shortly, 1985, October 21st, is a very special day. But Alan will say more about that later. Anyway, so is that okay? That's sort of like the idea of, and I hope that's not too Quorn. I'm trying not to make this too Quorn-centric, because that just bores everybody. But it's a really interesting story, I think, to illustrate this important point now, which is where we are today. So this is like the current context. You can read those numbers for yourself. 110,000 chickens, all those pigs, ducks, rabbits, horses, camels, and one unfortunate mule. Anybody got any ideas what that might be?
How many processed per minute?
That's pretty good, actually. Yeah, that's the number of animals that are killed every minute of every day globally, not in the UK. That would be a bloodbath. But globally, that's the number of animals. And I'm not here to lecture anybody about the rights and wrongs of eating meat. And this is really important to say this now. Quorn as a brand has never been on a very anti-meat agenda. The problem is, it's just we're eating too much of it globally. That's the issue. So, whatever your views on meat eating, it's very difficult when faced with those numbers not to just have a little bit of a stop and think moment at the scale of what's going on globally. And of course, our desire for ever cheaper and more plentiful meat is driving a number of consequences, and those are forecast only to intensify. And those consequences are consequences on the environment and also on the health of our bodies as well. So let's have a look at those. So thinking about rank in 1964, they were worried about protein security. Now it's more about our desire for ever cheaper meat. And if you're interested in this area at all, I would thoroughly recommend this book. It's called Farmageddon, snappy little title, by Philip Limbury, who's the chairman of Compassion in World Farming, and Isabel Oakeshott, who's a journalist, and she's just recently done the Cameron story. Don't know if the two are linked, but some of his antics. Anyway, I probably should stop there. Anyway, so yeah, a really very, very good book. So let's have a look at a perspective, this is my perspective, on what does our demand globally, and I should stress that, it's not just about the UK, for ever cheaper and more plentiful food, meat in particular. What does that mean? Well, as I'm sure you know, depending on whose numbers you believe, by about 2050, the FAO say that we're going to need a 60% increase in food production because of the population growth to 9 billion. So that means another 200 million tonnes of meat, another billion tonnes of cereal. So the obvious question is, where is all that going to come from to feed us with our current dietary choices that we're making? And there's some interesting things going on in this whole space. So food waste, for example. Any idea how much food we waste? I'm sure you do. On food waste? Oh, it might be. I can only think of percent. It's a lot, yeah. I think in the US it's about between 30 and 50%, but 30% is the number that's quoted, and I think we're slightly better in Europe, around about 26%. But it's a blooming big number anyway. That's food that's just wasted. And then, of course, in terms of our current agricultural models, love this snappy little title, Silent but Deadly, from the Vegetarian Society. It's quite a surprise for a lot of people to know. When you think about greenhouse gas emissions, you immediately think about belching power stations and transport. Well, 30%, again, this is whose numbers you believe, but 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions comes from food and agriculture. And again, there's debate about this, but between 14 and 20% of that comes from ruminants because of the way that the animals are reared, and the fertilizers and all the belching and farting that goes on and everything else. It's really hard to sort of get your mind around. That's bigger than transport. And because we've all got this, particularly in the UK, this vision of sort of bucolic existence and cows grazing happily on fields. The reality is it's not like that in lots of parts of the world. And so this is a real problem. And if you put those two things together, it means that in any developed economy, 10% of its greenhouse gas emissions comes from food that was never even eaten. How crazy is that? And yet we're facing with the need to produce 200 million tonnes more meat and a billion tonnes of cereal. So that doesn't seem to sort of work, really, does it? And then, of course, there's the health of our bodies, and barely a day goes by between somebody talking about the obesity epidemic. You almost kind of just get a bit numb to the whole thing. But it is clearly a very, very big problem. And there's something in the press today about the sugar and some claims that the government are suppressing a report that Public Health England have done on sugar. I don't know. I sort of caught the headlines on that, but obesity is a real problem for us all. Tim Benton at Leeds, who's the UK champion on food sustainability, has done an estimate that this is actually costing £2,500 per household per year. This is obesity-related diseases. That includes things like mobility, impairment, and the rest of it. It will bankrupt the NHS without question. And we do a lot of work with the NHS because they're very big on sustainability on their procurement agenda, both in terms of carbon and also nutrition. And they're trying to do all the right things about addressing preventative a diet as a route to health and well-being. But obesity will bankrupt the NHS. Then, of course, land and water. So with all this need to produce more food, we talk about planet Earth. It's more like ocean Earth, isn't it, with 70% covered in water and only 1% of that usable. So everybody, I'm sure, remembers the Arab Spring, and that was precipitated in the end by food riots. People say we're 5 missed meals away from revolution. So as land becomes more and more scarce for the production of materials, then that becomes a bigger issue. There's a very interesting area. There's some debate about this, but peak phosphorus, have you come across that? The 2033, I think it is, some people are saying is when our ability to supply phosphorus for fertilizers will demand will outstrip supply. So we'll start having price volatility entering the market for phosphorus, which is a key nutrient in crops. And of course, people worried about the micronutrient content of crops because of this, the intensity of production. And you can imagine lifting whole planes worth of wheat from various parts of Canada and shipping them over the world. We've got to replace all those nutrients somehow. So people very worried about peak phosphorus. Antibiotic use, this is the one that I find most scary, and it's not really talked about that often. You occasionally hear about it, but you hear about it in the context of the poor old GPs and their over prescription of antibiotics. Well, one of the consequences, it appears people are saying, this is a very good report in The Guardian, about excessive use of antibiotics in animal production are things like, particularly in pigs, the rise of MRSA, and a lot of pig workers now are contracting these quite horrible sort of facial spots and the rest of it from contact with these animals. And there's a report about MRSA appearing in the food chain for the first time as well, coming from overuse of antibiotics. This is something that Compassion in World Farming sent me. A regular use of antibiotics in animal production allows things like this to go on. You can actually intensify the production of livestock because you can keep them together in more cramped conditions and become more efficient, and they use antibiotics to control the disease. In the USA, at the moment, 70% of all antibiotics that are produced are fed to animals. So in China, who knows? In the UK, we claim that we're more regulated, but actually we're using a lot of antibiotics in a prophylactic sense? So we're feeding them at sort of sub-clinical levels just to sort of keep the health of the herd optimal. And of course, we're not regulated in the sense that 70% of those antibiotics that are used in the UK and in the USA are antibiotics that are of significant clinical significance to humans. So inevitably, you have the concern about the rise of the superbug. And people talking about we're going to enter an antibiotic-free age quite soon, down to drugs of least resistance. That's some more stuff that Compassion sent me. It's all slightly disturbing, but again, it is this going back to this notion of intensive production of livestock that is needed. It's the only way we can produce the amount of meat that's required. And antibiotics play a vital role in maintaining the health of animals and herds kept in otherwise very cramped conditions. So there's a lot of debate about this. It's a fascinating topic just to Google and see what opinions are. WHO are calling for urgent action. Use of antibiotics should be banned worldwide. Anyway, you could read all that. There's a hell of a lot going on. And of course, this is being countered quite aggressively by vested interests. If you've not come across this before, it's fascinating, these so-called ag-gag laws in the US, where it's actually now in many states a criminal offence to go in and try to expose some of the practices that are going on in terms of intensive livestock production. And they tried to introduce that into Australia just recently and failed. And it will come to this country. We recently had a 30,000 pig farm application turned down in Ireland because at the moment we're saying, no, this intensive livestock production is brutality on an unprecedented scale. But of course, in the US now, it's a criminal offence if you even try to expose what's going on. So how's everybody doing? Is it cheery? Animal welfare. So within our consumer groups, this is still the number one concern. It sort of top trumps health and any other issues at the moment about concern about meat eating that we find in our research, that animal welfare is still right up there with consumers. And then in terms of other things that are going on at the moment, genetic modification is a really interesting area. Now, I stress from a Quorn point of view, we are not genetically modified, never will be, never have been, and that's great. And actually, from a commercial point of view, that's a nice competitive position in the US where we're up against soya-based products and there's a lot of concern about GM soy. But it's such an interesting tool for the toolbox going forward if we get these agricultural challenges. So, I mean, I don't know, what do you think about GM? Is it a good thing or a bad thing? Or is it a good thing? Anybody hands up good thing? Yeah? Anybody really against it, just out of interest? So, yeah. I mean, I'm not here to talk about right or wrong. A few things that are remarkable for me that somebody said about genetic modification is just because somebody writes a shitty email, you don't ban computers. So it's more about the way that GM is used. A nice little story, I think, is about, the vitamin A, where they're introducing that into rice to address blindness in Southeast Asia. That's just approaching completion, I think, and it's all wrapped up in patenting this particular technology. And the German scientists who've been working on this for years now was asked, how much money are you going to make from this? Because clearly it has massive global application. He said, well, nothing. So I grew up in Germany in the 1930s in grinding poverty. I know what poverty is like. This is my gift to humanity. And then you kind of contrast that approach with perhaps some of the big corporations and the way that they're looking at GM to exploit it for commercial gain. And you've got quite interesting ethical issues around that. So we go from what Rank was doing in '64, looking at protein security. We're still looking at protein security, but actually we've got a whole host of other issues now that are coming from our demand for more food, and in my opinion, an unsustainable demand for animal products that simply cannot be met sustainably without inflicting severe damage on the environment and also on our health. So we try to think about this in sort of three buckets. The first one is diet and health, second one is sustainability, and the third one, it's a picture of my son, only kidding, it could be actually, is behaviour change. Because of course, unless we do something different, then nothing will change. As my old nutrition prof used to say to me, Tim said, nutrition is great, but it's the science of what the other person should eat. And I think that's probably very true when it comes to things particularly around sustainability. When we talk to consumers about sustainability and the impact that sort of intensive livestock production has on the environment, they go, and it's hardly surprising. I mean, if you're on sort of UK average salary with 4 kids and worried about is there even going to be Christmas this year, and somebody starts talking to you about your dietary choices and the impact on the environment, well, who gives a shit, to be honest? For a lot of people, it's just can't think about that. And so we've got to find a way of making more of us think differently about our dietary choices. And people are talking more and more, and I think Alan's going to pick on this topic later, this thing called the trilemma, which is talking about how our dietary choices can no longer be separated from their impact on both the health of the planet and the health of our bodies. If we can get that notion going in people's minds, then we have a better chance of behaviour change. And it's not about eating no meat at all. It absolutely isn't. It's about the Eat Better Alliance, a superb collection of NGOs, if you want to Google them, a lady called Sue Dibb who's doing fantastic work. Talk about, it's actually about eating less or eating better if you can afford it, and sometimes none at all. And that would make a massive difference, massive difference. It's not about not eating meat. Meat is a hugely important part, culturally, socially and economically, and all over the world. It's just the scale of it that we're, certainly personally, I'm really worried about. Ooh. There you go, so the trilemma. And actually, the surprising things we've talked about earlier, the biggest lever that we've got in all of this to make change is to eat less meat. And this is something that the government put out. And this is the organisation I think are really interesting, doing some great work, if you want to Google them. This came out yesterday, actually. That was very interesting. I haven't really read this, to be honest, but I sort of screenshot it and put it up there. But this study that for the FAO talking about the actual cost of the environment. And I think they're estimating that, where is it? Yes, the cost to the environment of livestock farming is nearly twice as much as the product value. So, to be honest, I haven't read this report. I only mentioned it yesterday. But I thought it would be useful if you're interested in this area, something perhaps to chase up afterwards. So all of that sort of gets to the point where, what we were saying, this is from Professor Alan Knight, that going forward we need new business models, both in terms of, I would suggest, the ethics of the way that we do business, but also, when it comes in terms of food, our a requirement for healthy new protein with a lower environmental impact. And what I've just presented, I think, is the evidence for that statement. So, people say, okay, Tim, I get it. I need to, do things differently. I need to, make different dietary choices. Could be about Quorn, doesn't have to be, but I certainly need to eat less meat. What am I going to do? Well, in the UK, we're not very adventurous as cooks. I think our third most popular meal is a cheese sandwich. So what people say is, does that going to mean I'm going to be eating cheese sandwiches then for the rest of my life? We joke, we laugh, but it's a serious problem. A lot of cooking skills have been lost. Our connection with our food has been lost. So when people say, well, I'd like to make a change, for the majority of people, that's actually, well, what am I going to do? And of course, for Quorn, we think that's great because it is so simple to use. If you want to make a spaghetti bolognese or a chili, then it's just simply use Quorn mince or curries. There's nothing that you have to do different. We're not asking consumers to do anything different particularly, just use a different protein source. And that's really, really important in terms of behaviour change. Now, so at the heart of, from our business, just sort of back to this to illustrate something that it can be done, is mycoprotein. So our 50-year overnight success, what is it? I thought that might be the question that you had. Well, it's at the heart of a whole range of foods that are available now in 16 countries worldwide. Very easy to use. It's about routine and repertoire, not sort of regime and regulation. Just try. If this is a bit later in the day, this is great. Everyone's getting hungry now. You probably just had breakfast. I love this. This is by Tim Spector. Another really interesting book called The Diet Myth. I don't know if any of you have read it. But it focuses a lot on this. The thing that we've missed most in nutrition science is the microbiome, the health of our gut, and the way that interacts with our body in so many ways, and actually how our dietary choices impact on the health of our gut and microbiome. And just, as a paragraph in there, he talks about Quorn as being a good example because Quorn is a combination of fibre and protein, a very interesting fibre. But I love this definition. This is, I wish I'd thought of it. So Quorn began by taking the original fungi found in soil and domesticating it in the same way that our ancestors did with many plants. I think that's brilliant. Because you can imagine 10,000 years ago when wheat first started to be domesticated, somebody had to go and find that you could do all the stuff that you do with wheat. You'll know more about this, Alan, being a baker. But we've only been doing it for the last 50 years as opposed to the last 10,000, but it is something that we found, a natural resource that we've now had to grow at scale. So I love that definition. Very briefly, under the microscope, if you looked at mycoprotein, what you'd see are these tiny tree branches, because it's a member of the fungi family. It's filamentous, and that filamentous property is how we can create meat-like texture, because we can know how to bundle those filamentous fibres together, the hyphae. We do that actually by ice crystal growth, by freezing, pushing the fibres together to create fibrous bundles that gives you a meat-like texture. And then under the microscope, you'd see sort of fairly sort of typical cellular organisation, fibre on the outside, protein, cell contents in the middle, but high-quality protein. It's got this thing called a protein digestibility corrected amino acid score, which some nutritionists amongst you will know, which is close to 1, so it's almost a perfect protein, which is quite unusual for plants. Although if there's a mycologist here, say that's not a plant. I know. And then some fascinating clinical research on the benefits of diets rich in mycoprotein around cholesterol reduction, satiety, and some work that Alan and I are doing with Gary Frost at Imperial on insulin and glycemia. And then some very interesting work that we just started actually on short-chain fatty acid production from fibre digestion. And short-chain fatty acids are really important for promoting health and well-being, and possibly linked into satiety. And anyway, really, really interesting new area of fibre research. So that's how fibrosity is created. So there you go. That's a little bit of Quorn chicken under the microscope. But if you look here, this is textured soya. That's that's poultry rather, and this is the Quorn. So remember I was talking about the fibrosity, the tiny sort of tree branches. You can see here you've got some fairly big cables with soya. So imagine biting through those and you'll get compression and then it'll go. That gives you a sort of slight rubberiness to it. And then if you imagine turning your teeth through 90 degrees, you get less of that. So you get this kind of two-dimensional effect. So it's sort of kind of quite rubbery and chewy in one direction and not quite the same in the other. Whereas with poultry and with Quorn, because you've got these laminations, you get this compression fracture happening lots of times as you bite through it, which in material science view is represents fibrosity, which actually is something that we all like. We all like fibrous, chewy food. It's a sweeping generalisation, I know, but in the main, that's what a lot of consumers are looking for. And you get that with poultry, you get it with Quorn, less so with textured, extruded vegetable proteins. Thinking about the whole sort of, we need to produce food more efficiently, we can't just keep making turn animals into factories, then this is quite interesting in terms of our technology, which doesn't sound very foody, but is fungal fermentation. So that represents the potential, that's actually freeze-dried mycoprotein, and has the potential to produce over 45,000 tonnes of mycoprotein, because we grow that up in the way that the brewers and the bakers will, and create a sort of kind of like a mother culture, but like sourdough starter culture. And then from that, we can do successive fermentations to create protein. And the interesting thing about fungal fermentation in the context of sustainable new technologies is if you imagine a ton of wheat, then the millers will be able to separate out the gluten, the protein part of it, and that goes off to be used in, what's it used in, Alan? Spaghetti? Bread? Yeah. So yeah. And that leaves behind the starch, which of course we can then ferment the starch to protein using mycoprotein. So you actually end up with more protein than you started with. Now you compare that with feeding the notional 1 ton of wheat to animals, and of course it's a very inefficient conversion. You end up with a lot less protein than you started with. So I think fermentation technology in general is a very interesting area to address some of these issues of sustainable new proteins. Just bringing the environmental impact to life a bit more, we've done a lot of work with Carbon Trust. We found this to be hugely important because you need third parties to advocate on your behalf who are trusted rather than just us saying it. And to cut a long story short, the Carbon Trust have looked in very great detail at our process, done this thing called the life cycle analysis, and finding things like, in terms of greenhouse gas content, depending on the beef system, comparing Quorn mince with beef, then up to 50 times or 12 times higher content in beef products, greater land use, greater water use, and even in non-ruminants like poultry, the efficiency of the fungal fermentation technology is quite stunning. And this is great for me. It satisfies that intuition we've had for years that this was environmentally more benign than the creation of animal protein. Just a bit of fun. We did this with Asda quite recently. We said, well, what if, it's quite fanciful, but in terms of Quorn mince, we said, well, what if every Asda shopper switched to using Quorn in place of beef mince in their weekly spag bowl? That's not a big ask. It's saying once a week, don't just have Quorn or a meat-free choice instead of beef, and you end up with these amazing numbers because, of course, there's a lot of shoppers going through Asda. It's carbon, the equivalent of 760 Eiffel Towers, 4 times the size of the Yorkshire Dales in terms of land, water saving, calorie saving, 38 times HMS Quorn in terms of fat saved, and I think very positively the introduction of a lot of fibre into the diet. So it's just a slightly fanciful way, but it sort of illustrates the point about how quite a small change at an individual level, once you magnify that out through a population, can have a very big impact. So, almost come to the end. I think I'm about on time. So this is my slightly patronising way to think about Quorn in terms of the 7 Fs. So remember the fungi family, first F, that's grown by fermentation, second F. It's filamentous, which helps us create fibrosity. That's my phone ringing, by the way. This is hugely embarrassing.
It was time to complete.
Thank you. Is it you phoning it? Yeah. Where was I? It helps us create fibrosity, which we achieve through freezing, creates new food, has a great environmental footprint. How's that for a contrived set of 7 Fs? So anyway, that's all about Quorn. And just leave you with a little thought that goes back, even longer than the Quorn business, from Confucius, which is as true today as I think it was then. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope that hasn't been too controversial. I think I might do a Craig Joubert now and leave the room before you have a go at me. But anyway, thank you very much for listening.
Joachim Treitzel-Döhler, Germany. Does it work?
I can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now as well?
Yes.
Okay. I wonder why all these meat replacers, are going for the texture and viscosity and bite of meat. Don't you think that people who want to say goodbye to their meat diet expect something like meat also in their replacement food?
And some people do, without question. So from our point of view, we have another brand, which is Cauldron Foods, that you may know about, where we do tofu, falafels, and sausages. And I know that is absolutely the logic, that why would you want to do that? All I can say is that is absolutely and overwhelmingly our experience of what people want at the moment. And I think it goes back to what I was showing earlier about if you're asking people to do something different in terms of dietary choice, it absolutely has to fit into your life easily. And that's where sort of familiarity comes in. So things like, Quorn mince, for example, is very easy for a consumer to understand how to use it, how to cook with it. That seems to us to be very important. But I think your point is a really good one, because it could be that Quorn is more of a transition into eating less meat, just because it's familiar and easy to use. And then when people get okay with that, then they'll start experimenting with pulses, with tofu, with other really good sources of protein and non-animal proteins that are around. All I can say is that's our experience. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Jake Norman from OAL. In terms of taste tests, when you do like the spag bog with beef mince and then with corn mince, what do those results look like? And then, if it was just to say, you don't actually have to say it's corn, it is meat, it's a straight meat replacement, it's advertised at that, instead of it's almost like a placebo. Is that something that needs to be happening if you really want to be able to just swap out meat in those areas?
Certainly product performance is absolutely vital, without question. But our psychology of our food choice goes a lot deeper than that. We certainly find with a lot of males that just even the idea of not eating meat is changing. So that there's a complexity around our food choice that exists. But to your question about how does Quorn perform against meat, I think the answer is it depends what you're used to. And it's a bit like, and also it's a bit for me like full fat milk versus skim. Often there is a difference, but it just depends what you like. And actually, we've moved slowly over years to skim milk, to semi-skim, and now going back to full fat milk is quite difficult. But we do always try to replicate as closely as we can the taste and texture of meat, because that's what our consumers say that they want. And an example is a colleague of mine joined the business for about 6 months ago, and apparently he said to his wife, "I'd better try eating Quorn, see if I like it." And she said, "Well, you do, John, you've been eating it for the last year." So we do see that, and it's usually, I know it's a bit of a stereotype, usually the female in the house has smuggled it in if the old man's getting on a bit and a bit worried about his health, and he might sort of, "Oh, I don't want to eat that Quorn stuff," but she'll smuggle it in and can't tell the difference.
Does Quorn have a shelf life?
It's pretty much just like a standard, in terms of shelf life, spoil in the same way that dairy, I suppose, is the closest. So,
How long is that? Yogurt or cheese or milk?
no, actually, without intervention, 7 days.
7 days?
Yeah.
That's from chilled?
Yes.
In your fridge?
Yes.
And obviously frozen 18 months, is it?
Yeah, at least, because actually it gets better, the texture, because one of the things about freezing is important in creating texture, and as time goes on, so the ice crystals grow and actually make it even more meat-like.
Are we working to make it a longer period in the chilled setting?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we're exploring a number of technologies, mostly around thermal interventions, just to maintain quality but extend shelf life.
Safwan Al-Asaf.
I don't think that's working, actually.
Yeah, Safwan Al-Asaf.
Oh, sorry, right.
Chester University. Very interesting picture you showed us, or the image of the comparison of corn and meat and poultry. Were they at the same condition when you took this image? Because a protein, as you well know, depending on the condition, it can have different structures or different textures.
Yes.
And there's a great deal of work
Yeah.
mixing a protein with other hydrocolloid or polymers that you can change this texture significantly. And
Yes.
this is probably
No, I understand.
to follow what
Yes.
Dr. Tritzel mentioned.
Yes. And I'm sure somebody could spend an hour showing lots of pictures of the creation of texture. It is absolutely crucial to this whole area about how you create texture. If I'm honest, it is only an illustration to make a point. But absolutely, there's so much more beneath that.
I think perhaps one more question.
Okay, thank you. You're obviously a very successful company, and the value of the business in the recent transaction proves that. I'm wondering if anybody has tried to copy you, and if they have, what have you done about it? Have you had to try to challenge them?
Yes, they have. There are a number of patents that exist, and we continue to file patents, although the master patent expired in about 1993. So the level of protection we have is the patent protection that we do have, the scale of investment that would be required to copy what we do, but more importantly, I think, the know-how that goes behind how you do it. So if you think about, we've got fermenters that are 180,000 litre sterile airlift fermenters that will run continuously for 40 days. Now, making that happen, and we know how to do that at a design rate that's double what the design rate was originally. So the know-how that's in that is, to be honest, at the moment, you just buy the business. It would be a lot cheaper and easier. But there will come a point, absolutely, there will come a point, I think, where this fermentation technology, because I think it is so efficient and important and offers so much potential, that it will become attractive to somebody to say, well, you know what, we'll do this ourselves. So does that answer your question, sort of?
Yes, I guess I'm particularly interested because now you're owned by an Asian company, and I think a lot of companies are very concerned about Chinese copying.
Yes, well, our new owners are Philippine-based, so they're not Chinese. Yeah, so I mean, we'll see what happens in the future.
Right, okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.